welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Free Expression Friday series, an interview series from ABA's American Booksellers for Free Expression, celebrating the amazing work of booksellers, organizers, and book people in general, fighting for the right to read.
Hey y'all, it's Philomena from ABFE. Next week, for Free Expression Friday, we're going to get back to our normal course of interviews with free expression advocates and booksellers who are doing the work. This week, I wanted to pick up where I left off at the end of last year, talking about 2025 and what to expect in terms of legislation. And I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, especially now, but the legislative outlook so far is confirming my worst fears about what 2025 would look like. I want to emphasize that it's early days and there are still a lot more bills to be introduced, and we don't know yet which bills are going to go forward. So I'm not encouraging anyone at this point to necessarily start reaching out to legislators. But I do want to let you know some of the states that I have my eye on. First up is Oklahoma. Some of you might know that Oklahoma has a pretty rough outlook for the freedom to read in terms of what its state education department does. But now, Oklahoma legislators are trying to get in on the act. Here are a few strategies that I'm seeing emerging in Oklahoma that I am especially concerned about. The first two are things that we've seen in other states, mandating school districts to create book ban policies, which is to say request for reconsideration policies that are more likely than not to encourage people to submit specious book bans. There's another one that goes straight forward to the collection development policies, prohibiting them to acquire content based on vague standards. The term they use in this one is sexualized content, which is undefined, and I'm sure you can imagine how widely that could be interpreted. But there are also in Oklahoma two new fronts that I'm keeping an eye on because we haven't really seen these tactics before. The first one targets child care centers with don't say gay provisions. We've seen these attempted and in some cases succeeding in schools and libraries before, where people are saying that any books including discussion of gender fluidity or transgender people and transgender identities is de facto age inappropriate. What's new about this one is that it's targeting any child care center that is receiving federal funding. That's really worrying because we don't yet have the infrastructure to push back on it. So if you're in Oklahoma and you know anyone who has connections in the child care area, please let me know at abfe@bookweb.org. The next state I'm keeping an eye on is Missouri. Missouri has proposed legislation that would establish book ban policies that remove books during the review period. What we've seen in the past is that this is catnip for book banners because they know that even if they submit a challenge that ultimately doesn't go anywhere, they can get a book removed for the period while it's being reviewed, and sometimes that can take a really long time. We've also seen proposed legislation that would extend bans to digital databases, and another piece of legislation that would target any visual depiction of nudity, regardless of artistic merit. So that means treating Michelangelo's statue of David as though it's a Hustler magazine. We've talked a little bit about Texas already. I mentioned it in my last pod before New Year's, but I want to touch on it again because, again, there are a few bills here that would really create problems, potentially including for bookstores. One, Texas wants to get in on the game of banning books at the state level. Their Board of Education has asked to be included in making those decisions and making decisions that would apply to all school districts in Texas, and there's a bill in place that would make that a reality. Second, there's a law that would remove the requirement to consider works as a whole when making judgments of harmful to minors or obscenity. That's a huge problem because it means that you're not necessarily thinking about the context of something when you read a passage at a school board meeting or bring a case against something. It would potentially expand the number of books that could be challenged on this provision and stop bookstores, libraries, and schools from even having these books out in displays that are meant for adults if a minor could conceivably access them. And we've also seen a number of provisions that remove liability exceptions for educational use and for museums and artistic use and things like that, while putting extra exemptions into place for law enforcement. And I do just want to mention something really disturbing about these bills, that they do nothing to touch the carve-outs for child marriage exceptions. And next is a state that you might not think of as likely to appear in the book ban conversation, but that is probably going to change this year. And that is New Hampshire. So New Hampshire's elections have brought in a new group of people who we have reason to think are going to be more sympathetic to some of the book ban bills that were introduced last year that ultimately didn't go anywhere. But this year could be different. So in New Hampshire, we're seeing a parental bill of rights that includes the right of parents to object to books that are in the curriculum. And there is another bill, which has a House version and a Senate version, that would give the power to ban books to principals and on appeal to school boards, and allow them to be appealed potentially further to the New Hampshire School Board. So this is potentially another statewide book ban process in the making. And there are also legislative attempts to create content-based censorship provisions in South Carolina, in Virginia, in Alabama, in Maryland, and in Oregon. The good news is we're also seeing the opposite. We're seeing a number of legislators in a wide variety of states introducing bills that are meant to get out ahead of these book bans and say, not in our state, before it starts to happen. So I'm tracking bills of that sort in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, New Mexico, New York, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, and Virginia. These bills have a number of different strategies. Some of them are further along than others, but it's a good chance to get out ahead of it and start building support before people are able to ratchet up the protections against book bans in their state. So, where do you come in? What can you do about it? Well, the best thing that you can do is to follow us on Instagram at ABFE Free Expression and to sign up for our Voter Voice updates at votervoice.net/booksellers/relationships. Especially with the Voter Voice updates, that will allow me to reach out to you directly and reach out to everyone who is in a position to do something in that state to brief you, to let you know when it's time to write letters, to let you know which points to emphasize, and to explain what can often be arcane, convoluted legislation and put it in terms that you're going to be able to advocate with. So again, follow us on Instagram at ABFE Free Expression, or sign up for our Voter Voice updates, which are email updates, at votervoice.net/booksellers/relationships. You can also go to bookweb.org/advocacy to find these resources and everything else that we're doing. All right, thanks a lot. And next week, we'll be back with more interviews with free expression advocates.
Thank you for listening to Book to the Bookstore Education Podcast, brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!